really a pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to join today, and especially thank you to Protiviti for inviting us and being involved with us on this great webinar. Like I said, my name is Dan Zitting. I'm the VP of Product at ACL. I'm ultimately responsible for our products, our product strategy, the design of those products, what they do, that sort of thing. But I am an auditor by background, and started my career at E&Y, and before moving on to a smaller risk and audit consulting firm. And ultimately, my journey in thinking about how could I grow up, so to speak, to be a Rockstar auditor, led me down the path to working in software and trying to think differently about the way we do a lot of things in internal audit. So just to get started with our first poll question, just like to get an idea with everybody on the webinar today. Just want to see if everybody here is in internal audit or in some other sort of function, compliance function, risk management, accounting and finance, business operations, etc. And I would imagine we have mostly auditors here today, but we'll see. We'll see and kind of adjust as we go forward. Great. Looks like most of the answers are coming in. Quite a lot of the crowd today, of course, are in fact internal auditors. So 90% of the folks on the webinar today, with a small number from each of those other functions listed. That's great. So thanks especially to those of you who aren't in internal audit for joining and being part of the conversation today. So for me, this topic began with sort of my struggle and the things I've thought about over the years in terms of what would it take to be a Rockstar auditor? And for me, it started with a Winnebago. And I tell this story somewhat in jest, but of course, in my time at Ernst & Young, one of my clients was a large hospital chain that had hospitals all across the Midwest. And every year we chose a sample of those hospitals and we'd go out to visit and do audits. And we really put a lot of time and energy into this particular client. We were really proud of all the planning work that we'd done, met with the CFO for our annual planning meeting, and I recall clearly sitting there through my first big CFO client meeting, thinking about how much work we'd put in and the value we were going to deliver. And the CFO spends the entire meeting on his typing in his cell phone, and then makes a comment half joking about, well, when you go out and visit all the hospitals, do you think we could put you in a Winnebago for a tour of the Midwest? A tour of the Midwest to save on T&E expenses. And it really struck me that, our work really wasn't being valued there. And wanted to start thinking a lot about how could we do things differently to improve that perception. And so thinking about this, and the reason I've chosen the tick mark to pick on, there's a few things I know, and then a few things that I wonder about. I think that what we do as a profession, auditing is really a noble profession and really important in underpinning the integrity of our financial system and society. Every internal audit team I've worked with is certainly strapped for time and substantially under-resourced. And at the same time, a lot of new technology advancements have taken place that have really changed the game in most professions. And I'm not sure that we've really taken into account the ability to use all of those real effectively in internal audit just yet. So that brings me to the things I wonder about. Do we really have to do all the things we've always done? Tick marks, traditional audit reports, all the kinds of things that we spend a lot of time on in the field every day. Have we really truly embraced the possibilities that technology, and particularly things like social, mobile technologies, big data and analytics, are we really leveraging those in a way that transform our profession? And how well, when I'm out in the field and and in my audit plan, how well am I really spending my time in delivering value to the organization? So reflecting, and that's ultimately where this topic of discussion comes from. Do we need to get out of our own way to deliver more? And so I originally, as Lark mentioned, we posted this article wrote an article for KnowledgeLeader. Originally it came from an opinion piece for Internal Auditor magazine, and just chose the tick mark as the symbol to kind of pick on, to help reconsider the things we're doing and what could we do smarter. And the piece went over really well, I thought, in Internal Auditor magazine. I got a ton of really interesting emails, some fiery emails in both directions from the piece, and it clearly struck a nerve with folks in talking about the tick mark and using it to reassess just the kind of thinking we do and what it means in the broader sense of our profession. So if tick marks are that symbolic reference, I think the question that we'll get at today is what can I actually do to change practices, and what will the actual benefits be? And to think a little less about, in order to kind of get there, let's think a little bit about where tick marks, and by extension kind of the traditional way we do internal audits, where that comes from. And to get a sense for that, I'd like to post the second poll question. And this question will get at where do kind of our internal audit practices really come from? And so what we're asking here is, where did you start your journey in internal audit, corporate governance, risk management, et cetera? Was it at one of the very large audit and consulting firms, perhaps a smaller mid-tier financial CPA firm, financial audit firm? Was it an organization like Protiviti, a risk and consulting firm, or perhaps it was originally in internal audit or through a function in government or similar? So lots of responses on that, lots of responses coming in. Interesting to see, it's quite a few as I see the responses coming in. I'll give you a few more, just another minute here. An awful lot, unsurprisingly, come from the big audit firms, and it looks like a big chunk have spent really most of their career in an internal audit function. Looks like we've got most of the responses in, so we'll take a look at those. And you see, it's about 30% come from one of the big accounting firms, 12% come from some other sort of accounting firm, and about 40% have spent their entire career in internal audit. So the question that I think was interesting about the poll results, and what it kind of confirms, I think, is that a lot of the background of the folks ending up in internal audit comes from a background of financial statement auditing, and even when kind of looking around the internet at Googling things like where do tick marks come from and audit techniques, of course, overwhelmingly the information is geared towards financial statement auditing. But as internal auditors, are those techniques really the right approach given our much broader mandate and the core job of internal audit? And so looking at what's the actual IIA definition of internal audit, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, but internal auditing really the IIA says our job is to provide an independent, objective assurance and consulting activity designed to add value and improve an organization's operations. That mandate really stretches much more broadly than just auditing financial information. And so do the practices that we spend the majority of our time on really carry over? So in revisiting the actual IIA guidance to say that cover what is our mandate, or what are we required to do in capturing audit evidence, documenting our work, et cetera. There's a couple of pieces of guidance that are applicable. Certainly the definition of internal auditing that we just spoke about. The of course, the international standards for professional practice. And then there's, in the strongly recommended guidance category, the practice advisory, specifically on documenting information. So, of course, I'm not going to go through and read the entire audit guidance, but looking at Section 2230 of the Professional Practice Framework, it really lays out that what internal auditors must do in documenting relevant information to support their conclusions and results. And while there's lots of great information in there and the things that the Chief Audit Executive should be covering off, certainly one thing that it doesn't mention is that we have to tick mark and carry forward, tick and tie out detailed line item information all the time. So expanding that, of course, there's 4 sections to the actual practice advisory. And even looking at this more detailed guidance on our working papers, it defines what are the purpose of our working papers and what should we be solving for, but certainly no mention of the detailed ticking and tying that we tend to spend so much time on. The next section gets into the general purposes for supporting, facilitating the review process, documenting engagement objectives, things of that nature. Of course, no tick marks involved there. The third section gets into the organization, design, and content of the working papers, but no specific guidance on work papers there. And of course, finally, the last section, which gets into which speaks to how the Chief Audit Executive sets the standards for the various different types of working papers, and unshockingly, no mention of tick marks there. And the only reason I bring this up, and kind of harp on what the guidance says, is I think really here the charge is for us to really think differently about, reimagine the concept of what a working paper kind of fundamentally is, and think about how can we use them to make better evaluations and deliver more value than maybe what we've captured in some of our traditional working papers. So rounding that out, even for the government auditors, of course there's the same sort of guidance around enabling an experienced auditor. Work papers should enable an experienced auditor to follow the nature, timing, extent, and results of audit procedures, but again, no mention of detailed procedures like tick marking. So an awful lot of time and energy goes into preparing and creating documents like this one, of course. And in a lot of cases, we've moved to thinking, you know what, there's a lot more efficient methods in electronic working papers. So I do more of my detailed work paper development in Excel and Word and things like that, switching my tick marks to electronic means. And yet I think we're still, I would argue, really, is that really advancement, and what's really the reason for doing them at all? And I'll get into a bit later on. We'll talk about some of the techniques I see to use instead, in particular data analytics and sort of next generation techniques for capturing audit evidence that I think can symbolically replace a lot of what we do with tick marks in driving considerably more value. So all of that said, I think really the reason for this discussion is to think a little bit more broadly about how we spend our time. So the ticking, tying, the footing, and the recalculating, all of these are simply a symbolism that's being used here to think about, do any of us really have the time to pour through all of this line item detail, given the charge that we have as internal auditors to provide broad risk assurance across an organization? And in thinking about that, I'd like to take our third poll question. And hopefully, I hope this will be interesting to everybody to see the results. what we'd like to find out here is how well staffed do you feel your team is to handle the charge of providing independent objective assurance and consulting that helps the organization accomplish its objectives. All of that information straight out of that same definition of internal audit. So, are you woefully understaffed? Feel like we can make an impact, but it's really difficult to touch the different key areas of risk or different areas of concern that you feel you need to be providing assurance on? Or do you really feel like you're fully staffed up and ready to rock and roll? So we've got lots of responses coming in, well over 1,000 responses already in. Interesting to see. And I've taken the same poll on other webinars in the past, and it's interesting to see that in this case, it looks like most folks really feel strongly, hey, we can make an impact, but it's really difficult to touch each key area of risk. What's actually better, and now that most of it looks like almost all of the results are in, I'll share the results here. It's interesting to see that in this case, those saying, "Oh, we're woefully understaffed," is actually a bit smaller than what I've typically seen taking this same poll. And congratulations to those that do feel like we're fully staffed up and ready to go. So, considering that, and that it clearly is a challenge, to be able to touch all of the key risk areas, those things that really matter. How we spend our time is the most important choice we make, or certainly the biggest step in becoming a Rockstar auditor is choosing the right things to focus on. And I just recently actually had an experience with a customer of ACL's that's a well-known brand out in the Silicon Valley area. And in their case, they'd just gotten started with doing some more advanced sort of electronic auditing. And they were using some data analysis techniques to look for things like, in particular, to look for duplicate payments made when an invoice was paid twice. And really excited with their first result, came to find that they found over $1.5 million in recoverable expense. And took that with great excitement, took that to the CFO, said, "Look at this, we found $1.5 million," and the CFO's response here on the screen, "Can you please take this over to the assistant controller to handle? I've got $600 million worth of contracts to worry about." So I think the question, I think a big part of the question here is that same issue of how do we spend our time? If we were spending so much time looking at that detailed at the detailed information around specific payments, did we really use our time the most effectively? And so thinking about that question, we did a little research exercise at ACL, and we went through and read through the 10K filings for lots and lots of the largest corporations, a bunch of the Fortune 500, and looked through those 10Ks and looked at what they disclosed in the 10K reports as the key risks disclosed by senior management. And interestingly enough, there were some trends that come out very clearly. I think at the risk of sounding a bit controversial, there wasn't one of those reports where senior management expressed something along the lines of, we won't be able to report our financial results accurately, or something of that nature. Didn't come up in one of those reports. Yet what came up all the time was things like the ability to attract and retain top talent, pressure from competition, and certainly different sorts of quality, product quality, and customer operations related issues. And so I think what's interesting is that given that those are the risks that come up and most often expressed in the SEC disclosures by executive management, in my career, I've never once done an internal audit around the ability to attract and retain top talent or the risk of competitive pressure. And so I think that's an interesting question to say, maybe it's a bit of a thought exercise, but are we truly spending time in the areas that matter most from a risk perspective? And there's a great story along that line that I really like. And this story was published about Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And in this particular story, what happened was a doctor who had his wife was in for surgery, observed that much of the time the hospital employees weren't washing their hands all the times they should be, in accordance with the hand washing policy. So from a hospital perspective, kind of a product quality issue. The care, the customer operations, or the product delivered to customers certainly had a potential quality issue. And he observed through his wife's stay alone, there was over 60 times they should have washed their hands, but didn't, creating obviously significant risk to the control of communicable disease. And the doctor elected to work on this problem, and they went through an exercise of developing a hand washing compliance exercise where the team went through and built some methods for observing and monitoring and capturing interesting data about how often employees were washing their hands, and found that it was only happening about 58% of the time that it should be. They then implemented a series of programs, scorecarding and training and communication programs that got into dealing with this problem. And a couple of years down the road, watched the results go from 58% to over 97% compliance with the hand washing policy. And as an outcome, certain communicable diseases, things like urinary tract infections, things of that nature, went down by as much as 60%. So by getting involved in a bigger issue, risk and control-oriented professionals were able to deliver something that made a really big impact on key risks to the organization, and thought about how could they really continuously improve the experience delivered to customers. And so, just out of curiosity, in this particular poll question, and I like to ask this one in a variety of forums as well, is have you ever done an audit specifically around providing assurance around the risk of some of these areas, perhaps top talent retention or around competitive risk? And there's some great results already coming through. I'm actually surprised. There's some people who have certainly who have answered yes, definitely done audits in this area, but by and large, of course, the response is coming in. No, I have not, but it's definitely a key risk. Looks like we have a number of questions beginning to come in as well. Let's see if there's a couple of good questions that we can answer here while people finish up answering that poll. So there's a good question here around how do you support an audit finding or recommendation without fully verifying the test results through the tick marks and in supporting materials, etc. And I think that's a great question. And of course I'm picking on tick marks here as a symbol, and we all know never would we get all the way away from them, but I think it's an important question to say, with the technology that's out there and available today, aren't there ways to better tie supporting information inside of software systems directly to audit findings and recommendations so that things are fully supported without having to spend necessarily the same level of time and energy ticking and tying those things out, while also helping automate the review process to cut down on some of the review time. A number of other good questions in here as well. Lots of folks poking at questions about other sorts of audit guidance and things of that nature. We'll get to some of those in here a bit later on. So here's the results of our poll. Yes, definitely. 11% of folks say they've done audits in those areas. I'm actually really impressed to see that. That's the highest That's the highest response I've ever seen on saying that we've definitely done audits in those kinds of areas. Not surprisingly, no, but it's definitely a key risk. Certainly garnered the majority of response. So getting to the question that I'd asked there, I think the question remains: how can we recapture some of that time? And in picking on tick marks, really what I'm picking on is the time spent at that detailed level and the time that it takes to review such a granular level of line item detail. And what are some of the ways that we can work on that using new techniques and capabilities to reduce, certainly not eliminate, but reduce some of that time and energy. And I liken that to an interesting quote that I saw recently from a marine biologist when asked about a near extinct species of fish. The person responded, "Why would we spend precious time counting how many individual fish have expired when you could focus on finding out what's causing the crisis in the first place?" And I think it's apt to internal audit because in a lot of cases we do arguably spend quite a lot of time in the field work procedures, really kind of counting the bodies, and perhaps we could be more proactively providing, if we thought about new and different techniques, could we be providing some more forward-looking assurance and helping steer the ship a bit better looking forward. So I think there's a variety of technology tools in next generation audit, what I would call next generation audit techniques, that can really help to eliminate some of that time to recapture back into being able to focus on, hopefully, on some more strategic areas of risk. And certainly one of those that of course we've been talking about in internal audit for a long time, and of course one where ACL focuses a lot of our time and attention is on data analytics. And there's some great things going on with data analytics in a number of internal audit departments, and we realize it's not totally practical in all cases, but I find that there's an awful lot of the time when I find myself creating testing lead sheets and taking samples and tick marking out my test attributes, in a lot of those cases there's usually an opportunity to use data analytics. And certainly while there's a learning curve there, in thinking about, for that particular test, how do I find and work with my partners in IT to get access to that data at a transactional level. And there's certainly like we said, some learning curve in learning to do the analytics themselves. But the outcome is very often a much more powerful test, creating something that's far more repeatable, because what you've done with those analytics can be captured and reused in the future to completely automate out that testing. So even if the first time around takes more effort, the future runs can be almost entirely automated, and of course generating higher quality results because of the use of analytics and looking at an entire population as opposed to samples of data. And so really a technique that I think is important, and that we look more broadly at how could we more effectively use it in more and more situations. A really important thing for particularly new auditors, I think, to be focused on. There's also some interesting new and fantastic technology out there around mobile devices. So, for example, things like being able to use the power of mobile apps to use things like photo evidence, taking photos using the phone's hardware, video evidence, sound recordings, GPS coordinates, things of this sort of nature that you wouldn't maybe traditionally consider as audit evidence, but when properly integrated into the workflow in your technology, into the workflow in your working papers system, makes it so a lot of evidence can be captured in the field right from your device and embedded into the work papers or into the documentation captured in the system, so that you can very efficiently capture that evidence without spending the time it would traditionally take to capture that in a traditional working paper. Of course, continuous auditing and monitoring techniques, it speaks to stepping beyond the data analytics to say, in those key areas where we spend a lot of time, can we just completely automate it and let the analytics do all the work for us going forward and just notify us of exceptions. And finally, fourth area, kind of unrelated to the tick marks, but in a lot of cases, a lot of the chief audit executives, I've talked with a number recently, that are beginning to talk about, I really want to get away from doing traditional internal audit reports. And instead, really management's not reading them in great detail. My audit committee's not reading them in great detail. How could I move that into more of a dashboard or real-time reporting sort of environment, so that the outcome of audit results can be communicated more easily and effectively, automating out the work of creating the report for the auditors and creating something more valuable to the business on the other side. So I think that's also interesting to think about. Now, I like this quote because in speaking to the data analytics, I'm also responsible at ACL for our training business, and one of the quotes that we had from a relatively new auditor, of course, was as soon as I learned to use the analytics, it was like I just ticked and tied 500 million items all at one time, and it's fantastic aha for somebody new to thinking about data and analytics and how they can be used in the audit process. So I think that this is only the beginning, and I think the bigger challenge is thinking about, as a profession, how could we just reimagine more of our approach to begin to kind of self-solve for some of our audit resource challenges. The picture of the elevator here is relates to a great story that I really like about a very old building in New York City had a very slow elevator, and this elevator, the building manager got complaints every day about the elevator being too slow. And so they went to look, and they called up the elevator company, and they said, what would it take to put in a better elevator? And of course, it was millions and millions and millions of dollars to put in a faster elevator. So they said, well, we can't afford to do that. Could we look at this problem differently? And they hired a design consultant. And the consultant said, if I can solve this problem, would you pay $1 million for it? And the building manager came back and said, "Oh, $1 million? That would be next to free compared to putting in a new elevator. Of course we'd pay $1 million for it." And what happened was they came in the next day. They found the designer working in the elevators. They were installing mirrors in the elevators. And a week later, the designer called back the building manager and asked, "Have the complaints gone away?" And they said, "We haven't gotten a single complaint since you put those mirrors in the elevator." And what happened was, because people were busy looking in the mirror and checking their hair and things of that nature, suddenly there was no more complaining about the elevator being slow. So what a great way to look at the challenge, the resource challenge, and reimagine a new approach to resolving that. I really like that. Story. So, thinking along the same lines, could we reimagine a way to begin to audit forward a bit more and to think a bit more forward using some of these new audit techniques? And so this is a term that I hope to that I've seen a few folks adopting. I really like it, forecastive auditing. How could we use things like in those analytical techniques, for example, begin to point our analysis forward, so not just counting the bodies, but can we use predictive techniques and predictive analytical approaches to say, not only did we find X, but based on that we would expect Y to happen in the future with some level of quantification, and use that to support our audit findings in a new and different way, which is, hey, this isn't just something that occurred, this is what we expect the impact to be going forward. And so finally, I think there's beginning to be some interesting. I'm beginning to hear some interesting stories from actual folks in the field that are thinking differently about work papers and thinking differently about tick marks and how they handle audit finding remediation and audit reports and things of this nature. I mentioned the ideas of some folks to get away from the traditional audit report and go to more of a kind of a dashboarding approach. I heard another story last year at GAM, for those that didn't go to IIA GAM last year, a fantastic panel that the CAE of Google was on. And what she had mentioned at Google was one of their big challenges was, we spend so much time chasing down people, trying to get answers to questions about the remediation of findings and issues. And one of the things we did was we completely changed to more fit the company culture and began putting our issues in the bug tracker. Google, of course, being a software company, they track bugs in their products and submit those through some software called the bug tracker. They basically submitted audit issues through their bug tracker and began getting a much better response and remediation because they've so well fit the business and started thinking differently. So our last poll question here, this poll question asked, do you use advanced auditing or any of the advanced auditing and evidence gathering techniques that I've mentioned here, data analytics, mobile device, evidence capture, or fully real-time automated and assurance dashboards? Yes, definitely we use those. Kind of. We use such techniques, but not across all of our audits. No, but we'd like to evolve in that direction, and no, I don't really see these as useful tools. I got a great story or a great question in here. A couple of interesting questions at the top of the queue here. David asks, "Was the elevator story a true one?" That is a true story. Here was a great comment from Mark. He said, "One of my favorite questions: if you're an auditor on the Titanic, are you counting silverware or looking for icebergs?" What a fantastic quote. So it looks like just about the majority of our responses have come in here. Some interesting results. Again, congratulations to about 12%. We seem to consistently have today about 12% of auditors that are feeling super good about where they're at in their journey. 47% kind of, we use such techniques but not across all of our audits, and then finally 38% no, but we'd like to evolve that direction. So the last thing I wanted to share here was just to wrap up on another interesting presentation from GAM last year was from Richard Chambers. He laid out the 5 imperatives for enhancing internal audits perceived value. Assess and address apparent gaps in stakeholder expectations. Develop robust talent strategies. Implement enhanced methodologies for continuously assessing risk. Assuming a leadership role in coordinating the lines of defense and finding innovative ways to enhance audit efficiency. And I think in a symbolic way, this is I think a very aligned message. And how can we think differently about what we're spending our time on to achieve a lot of these core imperatives? So on that note, I think we will begin to wrap up. I think I look forward to hearing more stories from folks all across that are on the line and across the country on your journey in eradicating some of the tedious time spent in our audits and evaluating bigger risk opportunities and providing a higher level of assurance, and linking that directly to that's what we are focused on at ACL, and our vision statement as a company is a world where audit, risk, and compliance professionals are an organization's most sought after people. And we think it is something that when focused in the right places with the right technology, that's something that really is achievable in a direction that we'd love to see our audit rock stars out there move in. And of course, we believe that really well-designed, powerful, and easy to use software and technology plays a key role in this. Whether that's in thinking about complete audit management and or integrated GRC platforms to serve to better provide tools that are more efficient and can remove some of that tedium, all the way down to the things that we talked about simply in the underlying tools and techniques that can eradicate a lot of that work, including the things like data analytics. And so, with that, I'd really like to thank everybody for the time today. ACL and really is pleased to have joined the webinar today with the folks at Protiviti. And thank you so much. It's really been an honor, and perhaps we'll wrap up with a few minutes of questions that have come in. So, a couple of interesting questions here that are kind of at the top of the queue. Maybe I'll speak to, and then Lark can wrap us up. What if you do not have the software in the company to provide useful data to run analytics on? a good question, Kevin. I think that I think there's a question there, and I'd be quite surprised to see if there's really not any data out there that would be sufficient to be able to run the analytics on. It's usually more a question of working and being able to find it with IT. But even if there's not sort of core data like that, lots of other sorts of information, things like report files and PDFs and things of that nature, data can be extracted from those into analytical tools for analysis as well. The great comment from Richard. Sounds like they're down the road of doing a lot of the more sort of dashboarding approach to internal audit reports that we've improved by using the elements of a finding, going through them at the exit conference, and building those into dashboards. Thanks for the comment there. Thanks for the comment there, Richard. Let's see. Here's a great question from Jeff. Pretend you're an audit director for a day. If you could hire one person to establish a world-class analytics function, what profile or skills would you seek? I think that's a really outstanding question, and I get asked it fairly regularly about do I need a data scientist to come in and be able to run my analytics function? And I think for me, Jeff, really the most important question in doing analytics is not the technical nature of how do I do the analytics, but what questions am I going to ask of the data? And so that sort of analytical profile and understanding of the business to say I know what smart questions to ask are, I think is the most important thing. Pairing that with an interest and ability to use software tools, I think makes for a great leader for an analytics team. With that, I think we're getting down to the last couple of minutes. We've got a whole bunch more questions in here. We'll be glad to take those offline. And otherwise, I think perhaps, Lark, you want to wrap up for us?
Yes, thank you, Dan, for presenting today. It was a very good webinar, and we had a very lively group of sending in a lot of questions today. So, again, thank you, Dan, for presenting. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We had a great group, and have a great day.